At a glittering family dinner in Lagos, the table was full of laughter, music, and the clinking of wine glasses. In the middle of it all, Kemi's wealthy boyfriend stood up proudly and announced that he had just bought a brand new apartment. But it wasn't for her. It was for another woman. He smiled wide, waiting for applause, and the room burst into claps and cheers. Some laughed loudly, others looked at Kemi with pity, waiting for her to break down. Even the mistress sitting at the end of the table smirked, twirling her glass like she had already won. Everyone thought Kemi would cry, storm out, or sit quietly in shame. But instead, Kemi stayed calm. She didn't blink, didn't flinch. She simply lifted her glass, her smile soft but sharp, and stood up. The whole table turned to look at her. She tapped her glass gently, and the room fell into silence. Then, with the sweetest tone, she gave her toast. Her words were short, but they sliced deeper than a knife. What she revealed flipped the entire night upside down. In one breath, she didn't just expose her boyfriend, she took away the very power he thought he had over her. The laughter stopped. The mistress's smirk disappeared. Jaws dropped. Wine glasses froze midair. For the first time that night, all eyes were not on him but on her. Kemi's calm revenge turned that dinner into pure chaos, and nothing was ever the same again. The night was glittering and loud, with music, clinking glasses, and chatter filling the air. Kemi sat quietly at the long table, surrounded by her relatives and her boyfriend's proud family. People whispered about her the way they always did. She's too quiet. She never speaks. She's lucky to even be here. They thought her silence was weakness, but what they didn't know was that Kemi was holding on to something far louder than all their gossip combined. She had been patient, listening, watching, waiting for the right moment. Her boyfriend, tall and arrogant, rose to his feet, a smirk plastered across his face. With his voice booming through the hall, he bragged about his latest achievement. He announced that he had just bought a luxury apartment, but not for Kemi. No, he had gifted it to his mistress, who sat at the other end of the table, sipping her wine with a smug smile. The announcement sent waves of laughter and whispers through the room. Some clapped. Some gasped. And once again, all eyes turned to Kemi, expecting her to shrink into her chair, to swallow the humiliation like always. But Kemi did not flinch. She lifted her glass slowly, her smile calm, her eyes steady. The table grew quiet as the sound of her glass tapping echoed. Everyone leaned in, waiting to hear if she would beg, cry, or maybe pretend everything was fine. Instead, in the softest, sweetest tone, she began her toast. Her words were simple, but every syllable carried the weight of thunder. In one sentence, she revealed a secret she had kept tucked away, a secret powerful enough to crush his pride and set fire to his empire. She spoke of documents he thought no one had seen, of deals he thought no one knew about, of moves he had made in the dark that she had already dragged into the light. And then, she announced how everything he had built, every account, every property, every deal, was now tied to her hands, not his. The mistress's smirk froze in place. Her boyfriend's laughter broke off like glass shattering on the floor. His face turned pale, his lips parted, but no sound came out. The same relatives who whispered about Kemi being too quiet, now sat stunned, mouths open, eyes wide, as if they had just seen a ghost. The only sound in the room was the slow drip of wine spilling from someone's shaking hand. Kemi's single sentence had burned through the hall like fire through dry grass. She didn't shout, she didn't argue, she didn't even raise her voice. Yet her calm truth roared louder than thunder. In that moment, the power shifted. The woman everyone underestimated had turned the entire table upside down. By the end of her toast, no one dared to look at her boyfriend. All eyes were on Kemi, the quiet storm they never saw coming. The dinner table sparkled with gold cutlery, crystal glasses, and laughter that echoed across the hall. Everyone was in high spirits, or at least pretending to be. Kemi sat quietly in her seat, calm and graceful, even as her wealthy boyfriend rose to his feet with the arrogance of a man who believed he could never be touched. He lifted his glass, cleared his throat, and with a booming voice announced that he had just bought a brand new apartment. But it wasn't for Kemi. It was for the other woman sitting at the table, the mistress who had been parading herself around like she was untouchable. The room gasped, then erupted into applause, some out of shock, others out of excitement. Kemi's relatives exchanged nervous glances, unsure how she would react. The mistress leaned back in her chair, smirk tugging at her lips as if the night was hers to own. She twirled her wine glass between her fingers, her eyes fixed on Kemi with the kind of look that dared her to cry. She was waiting for the tears, waiting for the breakdown, waiting for the humiliation that would cement her victory. Everyone thought Kemi would lower her head, force a weak smile, or maybe even leave the room quietly. But she didn't. Instead, she reached for her own glass, her movements slow and deliberate, her expression so calm it unsettled the room. She tapped her glass gently, and the sound cut through the noise like a bell. The laughter faded. The whispers stopped. The mistress's smirk widened, convinced Kemi was about to beg or pretend nothing was wrong. But then Kemi smiled, a small but powerful smile, and began to speak. Her voice was soft, but every word landed heavy. She thanked her boyfriend for his generosity, and congratulated the mistress for her new apartment. The smug woman raised her chin higher, savoring the moment, until Kemi continued. In the next breath, Kemi revealed something no one in that room had seen coming. She announced that the apartment was not the only property changing hands that week. She had been quiet, but not blind. She had been patient, but not powerless. And in her calm, steady voice, she explained how she had just closed on a deal far bigger, far louder, and far more valuable than his little gift. Her words painted a picture of power that left the room in shock. The mistress's smirk froze instantly, her hand tightening around her glass. Her boyfriend's proud smile crumbled, his face pale as stone. Relatives who once whispered about Kemi's silence now stared at her in disbelief, their jaws dropping lower with each sentence. No one moved. No one spoke. The entire table had been flipped in a single moment. Kemi did not raise her voice, did not throw a tantrum, did not even break her composure. She simply smiled, lifted her glass higher, and toasted to her own victory. The room sat frozen, stunned by the quiet storm they had all underestimated. And as the mistress lowered her glass with trembling hands, she knew her win had slipped away forever. The dinner was supposed to be perfect, a glittering night filled with music, laughter, and pride. The long table shone under the light, glasses clinked, and plates were passed around as relatives whispered and gossiped. Kemi sat quietly, her face calm, her eyes sharp, as her wealthy boyfriend rose to his feet with the kind of confidence that came from arrogance. He smiled wide, held up his glass, and announced his surprise. He had just bought an apartment. But it wasn't for Kemi. It was for another woman, the mistress sitting smugly at the other end of the table. His voice was loud, his grin wide, and the room exploded in laughter and claps. People turned to look at Kemi, waiting for her to break down, waiting for tears or a dramatic exit. They expected her to storm out, humiliated and defeated. But Kemi didn't move. She didn't even flinch. Instead, she sat tall, steady and elegant, her smile soft but unreadable. The laughter around her grew, echoing off the walls, but she only reached for her glass and lifted it high. The sound of her spoon tapping the crystal cut through the noise, and slowly, the laughter faded. The room grew still. All eyes turned to her, curious, waiting to see if she would beg, cry, or pretend to be strong. But Kemi had no intention of pretending. She cleared her throat gently and began her toast. Her words weren't about love. They weren't about loyalty. They were about something much bigger. With calm confidence, she spoke about power, inheritance, and the deal she had signed only hours before walking into that dinner. She revealed how, while her boyfriend had been busy flaunting his little gift for another woman, she had been finalizing a deal that tied her name to something far greater than his apartment, an empire he could never touch. Each sentence rolled off her tongue like silk, yet it struck like lightning. The table froze in silence. Relatives leaned forward, eyes wide, jaws hanging open. The mistress who had been smirking seconds ago now gripped her wine glass so tightly her knuckles turned white. Kemi's boyfriend sat frozen, his proud smile collapsing into shock, his face pale as if he had just seen his entire world crumble in front of him. The same people who had laughed with him now stared at Kemi, unable to believe what they were hearing. By the time she finished her toast, there was no laughter left in the room. There were no whispers, no smug smiles, no pitying glances. There was only silence, heavy and stunned, as Kemi raised her glass one last time and took a calm sip. The power in the room had shifted completely. She was no longer the quiet woman sitting in the shadows of her boyfriend's arrogance. She was the center of attention, the storm no one had seen coming. All eyes were on her now, not him. And she didn't. The night glittered with laughter, clinking glasses, and the smell of rich food filling the air. Kemi sat at the long table, surrounded by relatives and guests who were eager to hear her boyfriend's next big announcement. He loved the spotlight, loved showing off his wealth, and tonight was no different. With his chest puffed out and a wide grin, he stood up and lifted his glass. Then, with a voice loud enough for the whole room to hear, he bragged about his new gift. He had just bought a luxury apartment, but it wasn't for Kemi. It was for another woman. His words rolled out like thunder, and the room reacted with gasps, laughs, and claps. Some people pitied Kemi, others whispered cruel things, and the mistress at the end of the table smirked like she had finally won. The apartment was meant to crush her, to embarrass her in front of everyone, to remind her of her place. But Kemi didn't flinch. She didn't storm out. She didn't cry. She only sat straighter in her chair, her face calm and unreadable, as if she had been waiting for this exact moment. Because what no one knew was that Kemi had been playing a longer game. Behind the scenes, while her boyfriend flaunted his shallow victories, she had been working quietly with people far richer, far more powerful, and far more influential than him. She had been patient, strategic, and careful, building her own path brick by brick while he wasted his money on empty pride. Slowly, Kemi raised her glass. The sound of her spoon tapping against the crystal cut through the noise, and the table grew silent. Every eye turned to her. They expected a scene, maybe a desperate speech, maybe even forgiveness. But Kemi's smile told another story. She began her toast, her voice soft but strong, and with just a few words, she flipped the entire night upside down. She revealed her deal, a deal that dwarfed his petty apartment. She spoke of business contracts, shares, and properties that had been signed into her name only hours earlier. She explained, with a calmness that stung more than anger ever could, how she now stood in circles her boyfriend could never enter. The mistress's smirk froze mid-laugh. Kemi's boyfriend's proud grin slipped from his face, leaving him pale and silent. Relatives who had whispered about Kemi being too quiet now sat frozen, their mouths hanging open in disbelief. The apartment that was meant to shame her suddenly looked like nothing but a cheap toy compared to what Kemi had revealed. His so-called gift, meant to humiliate her, had been stripped of all meaning in one breath. By the time she finished, the room was silent. No one dared to laugh, no one dared to clap. All eyes were locked on Kemi, the woman they had underestimated for far too long. She sipped her wine slowly, her calmness more powerful than any outburst. That night, the apartment backfired, and the man who thought he had embarrassed her was the one left exposed. The dinner started like a celebration. The table was set with glittering plates, golden cutlery, and glasses filled to the brim. The air buzzed with laughter, whispers, and the sound of music playing softly in the background. Kemi sat quietly, her calm face hiding the storm she carried inside. Everyone around her thought they knew who she was, the quiet girlfriend who stayed in the shadows while her wealthy boyfriend shone in the spotlight. He loved the attention, loved to brag, and tonight he wanted the world to clap for him once again. With a wide smile and a glass raised high, he stood up to make his announcement. His voice boomed through the hall as he revealed his gift. He had just bought a brand new apartment, but it wasn't for Kemi. It was for another woman, the mistress sitting smugly at the other end of the table. For a moment, the room was silent, then it erupted. Laughter filled the air, mocking, sharp, and cruel. Some clapped loudly, some shook their heads, but most turned to Kemi, waiting for her to crumble under the weight of humiliation. The laughter stung, but Kemi didn't flinch. She didn't cry, didn't storm out, didn't even let her smile fade. Instead, she slowly lifted her spoon and clinked it gently against her glass. The soft sound cut through the noise like a bell. The laughter died down, one voice at a time, until the entire room turned to her. She rose from her chair, tall and graceful, her glass held firmly in her hand. Her voice was calm, almost sweet, but each word carried weight that pressed heavily on the room. She thanked everyone for coming, thanked her boyfriend for his announcement, and then, with perfect timing, she dropped her revelation. In less than 30 seconds, everything changed. She spoke of the deal she had closed only hours before, a deal so powerful it made his gift look like pocket change. She revealed how, while he spent his money trying to humiliate her, she had been quietly building something greater, something that now belonged to her alone. The mistress's smirk slid off her face like melting wax. Kemi's boyfriend froze, his glass trembling in his hand as his smile vanished. Relatives who had been laughing seconds ago now sat wide-eyed, jaws open, unable to believe what they were hearing. The room grew so quiet you could hear the slow drip of wine spilling from an overturned glass at the edge of the table. In that silence, Kemi didn't raise her voice or boast. She simply lifted her glass higher, smiled softly, and toasted to her new victory. The power in the room had shifted completely. The woman they laughed at just moments ago now held all the attention, all the respect, and all the control. And as she took a calm sip of her wine, it was clear, her silence had roared louder than their laughter ever could. The night glittered with candles, crystal glasses, and the sound of forks against plates. It was supposed to be another evening where Kemi's boyfriend stole the spotlight, bragging about his wealth and feeding his pride while she sat quietly by his side. For years, her family had whispered about her being too quiet, too soft, and too dependent. Her boyfriend treated her like she was lucky to be chosen, and even Kemi herself had once believed that she was smaller than she truly was. She had been underestimated her entire life. But that night, she was not the victim they thought she would be. The room shook with laughter after her boyfriend's bold announcement. He bragged about buying a luxury apartment for another woman, the mistress sitting at the end of the table with a smug smirk on her lips. Guests clapped, some whispered cruel jokes, and others turned to Kemi, waiting to see her break down. But Kemi didn't lower her head. She didn't leave the room in tears. Instead, she lifted her glass with quiet strength, tapped it against her plate, and stood up. The sound rang through the hall, and slowly, the laughter died. Her smile was soft but sharp, and when she began to speak, her calm voice carried more power than a shout. She didn't just reveal a secret, she detonated a truth that none of them were prepared for. She spoke of alliances her boyfriend thought he had kept hidden, deals he thought no one knew about, and lies that had been whispered in the dark for years. She laid them bare, one after another, like cards falling onto the table. Every sentence peeled back another layer of betrayal, exposing the rot that had been festering under their proud smiles. Her relatives gasped. The mistress's smirk froze in place, her fingers trembling against her wine glass. And her boyfriend, once so arrogant, sat frozen in silence, his face pale as if the ground beneath him had collapsed. The empire he had built on pride and secrets crumbled in a single moment, all because of the woman he thought he could humiliate. Kemi's words didn't just reclaim her dignity. They flipped the power in the room. She was no longer the quiet girlfriend they dismissed, no longer the woman they thought they could laugh at. She was the storm that swept the table clean, the voice that cut sharper than betrayal. By the time she finished, the hall was silent, so quiet that the faint drip of spilled wine echoed like thunder. Everyone stared at her, not with pity this time, but with shock and respect. Kemi had been underestimated her entire life, but in that moment, she stood taller than anyone in the room. She had dismantled the lies, exposed the hidden truths, and shown them all exactly who she was. That night, Kemi didn't just survive humiliation, she rewrote her story in front of everyone who had ever doubted her. The hall was glowing with lights and laughter when Kemi's boyfriend stood up, puffed with pride, ready to deliver his big surprise. He loved attention, and he loved using it to show his power. With a wide grin, he announced that he had just bought a brand new apartment. But the gift wasn't for Kemi. It was for the mistress sitting smugly at the far end of the table. For a moment, the room went silent, then it burst into laughter and whispers. Some clapped, others shook their heads, and all eyes turned to Kemi, expecting her to collapse under the weight of humiliation. But instead of shrinking, Kemi calmly raised her glass. She didn't rush. She didn't tremble. The soft sound of her glass tapping against the plate hushed the room. She stood tall, her eyes calm, and when she finally spoke, her voice was sweet but laced with venom. With one sentence, she dropped the kind of truth that scorched everything in its path. The apartment wasn't the real prize. The real power, the real deal, had already been sealed by her hours before. And it was far bigger, far louder, and far more valuable than anything her boyfriend could ever offer. The mistress's smirk vanished instantly, replaced by shock. Her boyfriend's face drained of color, his proud grin falling apart. Relatives who had been laughing seconds ago sat frozen, their jaws wide open. In less than a minute, Kemi had flipped the entire night upside down. The man who thought he was untouchable crumbled, the mistress shrieked in disbelief, and the family could only sit in silence as Kemi, the woman they underestimated, rewrote her story in front of their eyes.